Ubisoft has gone on record as saying making video games is less dependent on hit titles than it used to be. I really want to discuss this one with you gals and guys in the comments below because it interests me quite a bit. But first, my opinion, I'm Tarmac and this is Feature Creep. The price debate in gaming is always a unique one. It's filled with loads of pseudo-economists, many of whom are in their 20s or younger, arguing about how gaming has got more expensive over time. And they're not wrong, assuming that you accept their worldview, which admittedly is a bit short where it comes to the passage of time. I say this as a 34-year-old gamer. You see, over the last 10 years or so, there's been something of a shift in game cost. Part of it is overt, that being a change in the actual price. The second part is more nefarious, which is the microtransactions I rail on about from time to time, but I'll deal with that a little bit later in the video. In the mid-2000s, the average game price for upper-tier titles shifted from $49.99 to $59.99, so most of those people in their 20s gaming right now will have been around for that price shift, and they might even remember it. Metal Gear Solid 2 was $50, so was Final Fantasy Online, and if you look, plenty of other titles, whereas mid-2000s releases like Oblivion, Mirror's Edge, Call of Duty 2, and so on, all took a happy $60 price tag. What gamers in their 20s often don't realize, though, is that gaming is much older than they are. If you take that same launch price view of game titles, you'll run into a huge array of price variety before the year 2000. All throughout the 80s and 90s, you'll find AAA game releases anywhere from $30 to $100 for their launch price. Final Fantasy III launched with an $80 US price tag. Street Fighter II launched at $70. Once you've gone back that far in price history, looking at prices today doesn't seem so bad. And talking about inflation, of course, is a valid point of comparison in any price discussion. But how does accounting for price inflation do anything other than confirm my point? Games were often more expensive 20 years ago than they are today, and when you add inflation into the mix, that disparity only grows. This is where some of the comments that came out of Ubisoft recently are extremely interesting and frustrating. Now, I always have a hard time believing them when they talk about numbers. This is, after all, the same company that lied to us about having a 93 to 95% piracy rate across all of their games. If that lie were true, you can extrapolate how many gamers there must be in the world playing Ubisoft video games, and unfortunately for them, that would mean that 128 to 180 million gamers played Watch Dogs. This seems like an unlikely occurrence given even the best conceivable scenario. But I digress. The Ubisoft CEO said during their recent investor day that the video game industry is less hit-driven and becoming a more dependable recurring source of revenue. It's no secret that digital revenue outside of game sales is a huge online market. Now, Ubisoft also plans to push multiplayer heavily and are expecting a 60% increase in revenue over the next 3 years. Do you think that they're going to make that kind of serious revenue increase by reducing the number of games that they put out on a yearly basis and expecting the sales of the Ubisoft products that do come out to more than double? Of course not. This growth will come from microtransactional games as a service platform design. There's one very significant benefit here that not a lot of people talk about with microtransactions. If companies like EA, Activision, and Ubisoft want to make a killing with microtransactions and small-scale DLC, the games have to be good enough to keep people playing long enough to actually want to invest further. That's where the statement from Ubi a while back about not doing any more fire and forget games really rings true. This is success that they're seeing pay off in spades with Rainbow Six Siege. Make a great game that really plays to its strengths instead of being everything to everyone, and you'll keep a good solid community on it long term. I know that that's at odds with my current view on Street Fighter V, but that apparent gap is because unlike Siege, Street Fighter as a brand is predominantly built on the greenbacks of casual, solo experience players. We're all told through games, media, interviews, and in some cases implied relationships, such as disappointment in sales figures at certain levels, that video games are expensive to develop. This I do not doubt. However, I've always questioned whether they are too expensive to develop on traditional prices. We don't get a lot of data on that because it's generally rare for developers to come out and tell us what the full game budget was. They're also extremely hesitant to tell us how much revenue comes from microtransactions. Well, unless you're Rockstar and want to show everyone how well endowed your GTA Online revenue is. What is clear, though, having followed Ubisoft throughout the last few years, is that their revenue is consistently increasing, and so are their profits. Go back to that statement we started this with. The industry has become less hit-driven, more dependable. They're releasing fewer games overall, swapping out franchises year over year, and still expecting a 60% revenue increase over the next 3 years. That revenue increase certainly could be guessing at how well their games would do, or it could be a trend analysis on a much more consistent, ongoing revenue stream that lacks the ups and downs of a feast or famine development launch cycle, that being games as a service, online DLC, and microtransactions. The thing is that Ubisoft is already a profitable entity. It's not uncommon to hear the tried and true defense of developers and publishers adding extra costs. Games are expensive and getting more expensive, so of course customers should be expected to pay more money, all without any metrics, all without any consideration for how poor a logical argument it is to say that since something is expensive, customers should be happy with and accept prices going up, and not considering the level of profit already present. It simply does not follow, not without more information at least. It's also worth considering that some aspects of game development are actually getting cheaper. The tools are so much better now than they were 10 or 20 years ago. At the end of the day, though, I have one major musing about the cost of video game development. I've heard so many arguments about how these games cost more to make and we should pay the price, but those arguments disregard a particular push in the game industry that appears to be something of a concerted effort. For the most part, while gamers exert some control over the direction gaming goes, did you notice how the console wars regressed frame rate in favor of texture quality? Did you notice the industry at large informing gamers that 30 frames per second was more cinematic? Along the way, have you noticed that at the very least AAA developers are choosing to make more grand experiences? They chose to make games that were more expensive to make. In fact, the polar opposite of what we started this video with, the Ubisoft statement that gaming is less hit-driven, would seem to indicate that the rushed one-upmanship is a dying art. Developers and publishers have made this bet. It was an active choice to produce games of a certain production cost and at a certain retail price. And that choice resulted in profits for the big groups. Everyone wanted to have the next big hit instead of a more steady relationship with their customers. So games got bloated and got rushed. Hardly a surprise. I wish we had more solid data on video game budgets, and not just the record-breaking chest-boasting ones, but the failures as well. What we do know is only 1 year in the last 6 for Ubisoft has had a net loss, and that was the year the Xbox One and PS4 launched. Given the end of the old console generation and slow start to the new one, that's also hardly a surprise. Every other year since 2011 has seen a steady profit increase, and they're well on track to have an amazing year this year as well, which we'll have more data on in a month or so. Profits climbing the way they are for Ubisoft sure seem to indicate that the microtransactional additions are doing very well and unlikely to be discontinued, well, ever. They were profitable in almost every year since the mid-2000s when the $60 price consolidation happened, and they only got serious about microtransactions in the last few years. So the next time you ask yourself or see someone else ask the question, are games getting too expensive to make? Just remember that Ubisoft and others have been profiting very well all along. Now they're just profiting more. There are perfectly valid reasons to be happy that a game company is making a great amount of cash. Usually it means they're making great products, which is awesome. But since they're already making money hand over fist and have been for a long time, what's the justification for gamers online defending price increases because games are too expensive to make? Because apparently, they aren't too expensive to make at all. Let's chat about video game pricing. I'm curious to hear where you see value and what your money is buying out there in the greater game marketplace. If you enjoy Future Creep, please help the channel out by subscribing and maybe sharing these videos on places like Reddit, Twitter, and such. That's all I have to say. Tarmac out.